But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Matthew 6:33. One of the things this verse addresses is our focus. If we spend our time comparing ourselves to others, it's always a losing battle. The disciples compared themselves to one another and argued about who was the greatest in Luke 9:46 and following. Jesus told a story about a Pharisee who compared himself to a publican and thought he was super special because he did so many admirable things. But it turns out that it was the publican or tax collector who was justified because he understood his need for the mercy of God. You can look at Luke 18:9 and following for that story. Even when Peter, having just learned what had happened to him in old age, wanted to know John's fate, he was given the WITTY principle. Jesus basically said to Peter in John 21, verse 23, that if he ends up treating John differently than Peter, it's none of his business. What is that to you? The WITTY principle. When you compare yourself to other people, one of two things happens. Either you get puffed up because you think you are better than the person you are comparing yourself to, or you get discouraged because you feel inferior to those around you. Neither outcome is helpful. St. Paul saw this happening in the Corinthian church and wrote in 2 Corinthians 10:12, "Not that we dare to classify or compare ourselves with some of those who are commending themselves, but when they measure themselves by one another and compare themselves with one another, they are without understanding." Another related focus issue is, are you worried more about what God thinks or what others think? St. Paul was quite firm about the fact that worrying more about what others think is not the proper focus. He writes in Galatians 1:10, "For am I now seeking the approval of man or of God? Or am I trying to please man? If I were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ." Satan is constantly trying to mess up our focus. He wants us to compare ourselves to others. He wants us to worry more about what others think than what God thinks. But Jesus tells us in John 10:4 that his sheep know his voice and will follow him. One of the keys to fighting the urge to compare ourselves to others and to losing our focus in other ways is to know the voice of Jesus. As we read, study, and memorize his word, we allow Jesus' words to shape our perception of ourselves and life rather than the lies of the adversary. And that's when our focus will be where it needs to be. Press on in the Lord.